Yeah, so Calix, why don't you introduce yourself to our participants really quickly?
Sure. Everyone, I'm Calix. I'm I'm interested in just startup software engineering, all of the above. I previously just kind of worked in startups. I've started my own. I've sold a few, and so currently I'm just working at Fiveable. At multiple startups actually. I'm working at a company called Fiveable. I'm working at a creator slash consumer startup called Beacons.ai, and then I'm incoming at a stealth startup in crypto.
I'm going to start this off, but Calix, what is your experience founding your own startups and what did you feel like you learned from it?
I think the first time I started my startup, it was like, it depends on what you would consider a startup. I think the first quote unquote initiative that I started was pretty jank. It wasn't really anything solid. But I think it was a really interesting experience just to kind of direct the vision of whatever organization that I was running. And so I think as I kind of had more iterations, it got easier. It got easier to kind of navigate various challenges. But then every single step of the way, there were different challenges. So I think just learning how to.
Yep. So Edward just asked in the chat, how many attempts at startups did you have?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah. Edward just asked in the chat, how many attempts at startups did you have?
How many types?
How many attempts at startups?
Oh, attempts. Okay, attempts. I would say three, probably three. I started the first one wasn't really a startup. It was like a quote unquote software umbrella company. One was I co-founded an edtech startup, and then the most recent one was more of like a productivity app. So I would say three. The first two were kind of like flops in my opinion. So it took me 3 attempts, I would say, to have like a relatively successful attempt.
And would you mind telling us about like that, I guess, last successful attempt you had?
Yeah, it was a productivity app called Hours. It was basically it was kind of like an accountability productivity tool for students, mostly in high school and college. And so it was basically kind of replicating the accountability you would get if you were working in person with someone in like a library or a coffee shop. But during that time, it was in the first 6 months of lockdown. So obviously that wasn't possible. So I was basically replicating that feeling. But because it was digital, it allowed people to do this, to have the same feeling, but like with people that maybe in different areas across the country, across the world. So we had a lot of international usage with that too.
And Ryan asks in the chat, what was the biggest challenge you had creating Hours?
Usually I don't think that this would be an issue in the future, but like probably the technical constraints. It was definitely my first time building a project that was used on a relatively large scale. So making sure that I was setting up efficient systems was something that I never bothered to even care about. So I had a lot of production crashes. The app went down quite frequently for a solid month or two. And so working through a lot of those issues was definitely a big challenge.
And JPO also asked in the chat that they're interested in making a startup when they enter uni. So how do they know that they have a good startup idea that could maybe work?
I think the best answer I can give is I don't really know. I I was just in this program called Atlas,
where I met
and basically a common theme there is basically you have to test reality, you have to poke the world and let it poke you back. And so basically making sure that you're constantly testing, whether it's your users or just in general the market that you're working in, and letting it tell you kind of if there's traction there. I think that's important. So every single startup and idea is going to have like different constraints and different situational obstacles. So making sure that you can just say that, oh, I'm testing my users or I'm testing the market, letting it tell you if it's a good opportunity. I think that's more valuable than what anyone else can tell you.
Then I guess the question also extends to how did you realize that your startup idea was good? Or did you just, or was it just something that was sort of like trial and error?
Yeah, I basically I showed my friends the app a couple of times, and so they actually kept using it after the first try, which was like mostly uncommon because I had shown people some other projects that I'd worked on, and it never really gained that much traction. So seeing that was definitely a hint that I could keep working on it. And so as I kept putting it out there, more and more people kept using it, and so I think it was more helpful to. It was easier to be more confident that this was something I should work on.
Yeah. I know that you've told me this story, but I think it's pretty interesting. But how did you, I guess, find the idea behind Hours?
Yeah, I actually found it out like 6 months before I actually decided to start working on the project. I basically was kind of helping at this data viz nonprofit, and so I ended up what was the word? I ended up just one of my teammates kind of shared this article with me about this productivity technique called Hours, and that's what I named it after. And it was basically like an article that I don't think many people knew about or read. It was basically just if you're in a chat or like a video call with a friend, you can kind of just outline your tasks and what you're doing, and basically just outlining those to each other and providing accountability for each other. It actually, when I tried out that technique, it worked out. So I had the idea of like, what if I could just kind of condense this into a web app? And that's what I did. But 6 months after I got that idea.
Yeah, and there's more questions just popping in the chat. Edward asks, do you have a good way of seeking out good teammates for a startup? For example, they have a lot of technical experience, but when it comes to marketing or design, they're much less knowledgeable.
I think finding good teammates is really important. I don't have that much experience with it because most of my ventures I did solo, except for one of them I did with one other person. But meeting great people in all different places, especially in person if you can, is really important. Like right now, I'm attending a summit in San Diego, and there's a lot of really amazing teens here. They're here with me right now, actually. But yeah, I think making sure that you're meeting people, making good connections, building good relationships with them. Like it doesn't even matter if you become teammates or not. It's really important just to have that connection. And and then if an opportunity arises, I'm sure one of them will always be willing to work with you.
Yeah, and there's another question in the chat. So if you are getting started on a project, where do you start and how do you know whether you're doing a good job or not? So I guess that really relates to how you keep track of your own work and what kind of metrics do you set up for yourself?
Yeah, every single project is going to have different metrics, different goals that you need to set. And so like I said earlier, just kind of like making sure you're testing reality. Every single, the metrics you set for one idea is not going to be the same for another. So you have to constantly be self-aware and see what does success look like for this project? And then how can I set a metric to hit that? So like, for example, if it's like a consumer thing, you might look at how many people are using it, like the quantity or maybe the quality of a certain subset of users. But then if you're in enterprise, you're definitely going to look more in quality instead of quantity because it's more B2B. So making sure that you're being aware of what you're trying to achieve, setting up what success looks like, specifically numerical success, and then setting up metrics to hit that is something that you just have to do over and over. It's not a one size fits all.
And I guess as an extension of this question, a lot of the times when you're working on a new project, when you're coming up with an idea, you're going to face a lot of hurdles that are both, I guess, technical and non-technical. And it's very easy to, I guess, feel overwhelmed and demotivated. So how would you suggest against combating that?
I would say first off, making sure you have a good support system is really important. Just among family and friends. And I think having a good support system is really important. But also just making sure you're balancing your life properly is important. Like when you're a founder, your startup definitely becomes your life. And I don't think that that's always a bad thing, but it can be a bad thing, especially when that startup just doesn't work out. And so making sure that you're not putting all of your eggs and your energy and your motivation and your happiness on your startup is really important, because that startup will fluctuate on a day-to-day basis, and you don't want your internal feelings to fluctuate with that. So making sure that you're also attaching your feelings and your emotions to something else that's stronger is important. Don't just like go like 100% into your startup. You should pour 100% effort into it, but not your entire life.
I see. That's some great advice. And someone asked in the chat, what is your opinion on turning hackathon projects into startups?
Okay. Actually, my friend Nima wants to answer this question. He's a very accomplished person. The question is hackathon projects.
So I actually, like, how I started in tech was through hackathons. And to be honest, hackathons are a great experience because it forces you to ship. It forces you to put your product out there, no matter the little weird intricacies and your perfectionism. You have to ship by the end of it. And from there, if you get prizes or you get recognition for those projects, it really pushes you to like go further and go more. So an example was one time I did a hackathon that was sponsored by Microsoft and this NGO, and we ended up making a project to like track and map locust swarms of AI, and it got the attention of those two organizations, and we went on to ship it and get help from Drexel. It wasn't exactly a startup, but it was an initiative and project that launched and scaled after recognition. And because we were forced to finish this project because we wanted to do the hackathon, it was a great kickoff point. So if you ever feel like, hey, I don't really want to work on something, or you're just staring at that IDE and you just don't want to work, find the like closest hackathon, get some friends and ship something, because at the end of it, you'll have something and you'll take away a lot of stuff that you will apply later on. And it's painful. Sometimes you don't sleep during them. Sometimes it's really dreading, and like maybe you have it's good if you have a team of people you know and friends. They don't have to be 10x developers, but still have a team that you can trust, and you will ship something and you'll be proud of it and you'll be motivated to ship more. So yeah.
One of the participants is curious about the two companies. So
sorry, what was the question?
One of the participants was curious about the two companies that your friend talked about for the hackathon.
The two companies.
Microsoft and this NGO called the African Library Project. And then we talked to some professors at Drexel after that as well. So yeah. Yeah, Drexel University.
Yeah. And the participant says thank you. But there's another question. The question is, if I wanted to make a web app product and have some subscription system, what sort of papers works with banks and the government, and what should I expect?
So I would say, like, I haven't personally done it, but I know that subscription payments are really easy to hook up through Stripe. And then if you need a legal entity, I originally used to do it individually, but there's a lot of services out there that can do it for you. I don't know all of them. I know one of them is Clerky. Clerky's one of them. So they can help you set up a legal entity like pretty easily. You do have to pay for it, but you would have to pay for it even if you did it yourself anyways. So I would recommend those two if you're trying to hook up payments and also handle the legal side.
Yeah, and speaking of monetization,
Stripe also has Stripe Atlas. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Sorry for interrupting, but speaking of monetization, let's say you built your startup on the idea that, oh yeah, here's something great that I want to share with the world. But then after a while, clearly money will become a problem. So how do you approach the problem of monetization in your applications?
I don't think I understand that question. Can you say it one more time? Or maybe paraphrase it?
Oh yeah, it's how would you approach the problem of monetization within your apps?
What would be the problem specifically? Like no one wants to pay for it.
Yeah, I guess that's a pretty difficult question.
I mean, like, if no one wants to pay for your monetized plan, if you're on a freemium model and they just want to use the free version, I think you have to reevaluate. Like, there's two things you should probably reevaluate. One is the actual plan. Like, what are you providing in your paid plan that's just that doesn't seem valuable enough to your users. But then you can also look at the market. Like, let's say you're serving students may not always have the money to actually subscribe to your paid plan, so you should also look at who you're targeting and who you're expecting to monetize on, and you might have to pivot based on that, or you have to come up with a better monetization model than like subscription. There's a lot of different creative ways to monetize, and they're all situational. It's not something that you can just like name off the top of your head, but being creative with that, if your market is not easily monetizable, is really important. Like, for example, if you're an edtech platform, you're used by students, maybe you can target administrators, maybe you can target the actual educational institution. You just have to get creative with it.
And there's another question in the chat. What initial minimum budget should I expect for a new startup?
$20? You say $20?
Just the domain.
I mean, yeah, you need enough money for the domain, and then you need to host it. But like, other than that, for the domain, you don't actually need that much money. If it's software specifically, if it's hardware, you're gonna need like varying amounts of money to start. There's grants out there, there's fellowships out there, there's accelerators out there that you can get perks from and get money from. But like, in terms of actual like money, the only thing that you probably need is a domain name, and you can find a lot of free hosting options out there. And then only when you start to scale up is when you actually need to start paying for it. Like, when I was working on Hours for 6 months, I only spent like $150, $200 max. And so yeah, like, you really don't need that much until you start to like scale up your team or your product or whatever it is.
Yeah, so it sounds like aside from the work that you put in for a software project, it's really like the initial budget isn't really that much.
Yeah, it's not that much, especially in software. It's really accessible monetarily. So I can't speak for any other kind of startup though.
Yeah, and actually there's 2 more questions. So what's a sign that you need to scale up your team, and how about choosing teammates?
I would say, like, you could consider scaling up your team, like, one, internally, if you feel like you need more manpower, and that is really up for your own interpretation. If you feel like you need more help, granted, when you bring on new team members, you're gonna have to make sure you set up processes to onboard them, making sure there's good benefits, culture. So I'd also recommend that you don't bring on new team members until you raise some money, unless you really need team members beforehand and they're happy with being like maybe not compensated with, like, I guess, liquid assets. And so that's really up to your own discretion. But from what I've seen, it probably works better when you have actually raised a round and you have enough funding to actually to properly compensate someone for their work. But there's not really like a clear answer to that.
Yeah, and another question in the chat is, have you ever had sponsors or investors for your startups?
I haven't. There's like, yeah, I have not really been sponsored, and I never reached a certain range, if that's the word. I've never needed to raise, because for Hours, it was actually exited really early. So I can't actually answer that question. I've been in organizations that have been sponsored before, but it's like more of like a smaller, like, it wasn't like we had raised like huge philanthropy or anything like that. So I'd probably, wait, have you guys ever sponsored, invest, anything?
Like grants? You get sponsored?
Like your org, your startup.
Yeah.
You want to speak about it? Introduce yourself.
Am I on? Yes. Okay. Yeah, so I'm William. I did research in cybersecurity, and also worked in startups a bunch. But the whole spiel with like sponsoring is usually, I mean, there's two ways to get funding, right? One is you're working on like open source stuff and you get sponsored, and the other is you're raising funding. So on the side of like open source stuff, and if you're doing research and you want to get funded, there are a bunch of orgs that will do that for you. So some of them include like FTX Future Fund, who fund like up to $1 million on research. And there's also a bunch of organizations in this whole like effective altruism movement that fund really high amounts of money for research that Kevin can talk about too. Other than that, there are some VCs that also will give equity-free grants. So 1517, I think Contrary does too. Yeah, there's a lot of like free grants out there if you, for example, win hackathons, or if you just know people in VC, you can always just reach out. And yeah, I guess Kevin can talk a little bit more about the whole effective altruism movement and how to get funding from EA.
Yeah, I'm Kevin. I've gotten EA money. It's like pretty easy if you just like have your spiel be like EA focused, as in like solving some existential risk. Like, so like I got some grants to like do AI alignment research independently, and like and it doesn't have to be AI alignment research too. Like there are other people who've gotten money to like run like science bowl competitions or whatever. It's like as long as like have an EA like tinge to it, you can get money like relatively easily. Yes.
Yeah, and I guess this is another question for Calix, but did you ever sell any startup of yours, or are you still holding up on all three of your startups?
Yeah, so out of the 3 that I've started, I've sold 2 of them. One of them was really small, so I don't really consider it that an acquisition all the time. But yeah, I don't really hold on to them. There's not really a huge point of holding on to them. If you want to keep your products available for use, you can do that. That's actually what I would do. But that doesn't really make it a startup anymore. It really is just kind of like a tool anyone can use. So like a project. So no, you're working on or at least if I'm working on a startup, I'll work on it, and once it's closed or it's sold or whatever, I don't consider it a startup anymore.
Another question is, I understand that Hours was acquired by Fiveable. So what was your experience with that?
Yeah, that was very I would say serendipitous at this moment. I had initially reached out to them on a recommendation from a teacher to partner with them, because I knew that they had really good branding in the student space. But after talking with Amanda, their CEO, they actually just offered to buy me out. And so it was not really, like a lot of people asked me if I reached out. Like I definitely did reach out, but not with the intention of getting acquired. I actually just wanted to partner with them. And so we did some negotiation on the valuation, and then we went through like quite a few legal hoops to make sure that the transaction would go through successfully.
And if I'm not mistaken, you sold your company for 6 figures?
Yeah, it was in the 6-figure range. I don't think I can disclose it in a group setting like this, but I usually do disclose it on like smaller groups or private conversations. But it was in the 6-figure range, and it's in the lower quadrant of the 6-figure range. But yes, that's what makes the headlines.
Yeah, I remember reading an article about that. And there's another question in the chat is, did any of the startups continue to grow once you sold them?
Ours was probably the one that grew the most, just because Fiveable, like late last year, we literally pivoted the entire company to adopt it. So like it used to do AP content. We don't do AP content anymore. We just do virtual studying accountability. So that's grown quite a bit. I will say, like, it probably hasn't grown as much as I wished it would, but it's not really in my ballpark anymore. I help with product discovery. I don't build the product anymore. I don't make the huge product decisions anymore. So, but they have grown. It has grown.
And as I understand, you're still working at 504, right? So I guess how was your journey with that company after you sold Hours?
For sure. And just a heads, I think I could probably only answer like maybe 2 more questions. For this one, it's been good. I think like it was probably the first company that I've worked at that I played like a relatively major role in. And they're like relatively established too. Like we had raised our Series A right after the acquisition. It's been a great experience just to work alongside a lot of the leadership members. And you know, 504 is very interesting as like a lot of the people that work there, they're not actually like veterans in their specialty. Like, you know, a lot of our software engineers were previous teachers and previous tutors, and a lot of our HR was also previous teachers, and then a lot of students work there as well. But to get the diversity of the various people that are there is really interesting, and to still interact with them on a level where they just know so much more in their expertise than I do. I think there's a lot of opportunities to learn a lot of things, and so I've been able to learn a lot just by being there and seeing how a company of a bigger scale that I've achieved operates.
Yeah, and there's another question that someone just asked in the chat. Nicole asked, is it possible to work full-time while still having side startup at the same time? Like, does working on a startup consume all of your time?
I would say I don't always like support working on quote unquote side startups. Like you can like, I mean, it's not really like super bad. It's just if you work on a startup on the side and you have like other things going on, I wouldn't always consider like, I wouldn't say you should expect huge things, because you really need to dedicate a lot of time to making sure these things work out. I would say unless you're like a serial entrepreneur or you're really experienced and you know what to do and you've done these things before, like you really need to give your full attention. But then again, you can do whatever you want, and either way, even if you do it on the side, you're still going to learn a lot.
And when you started Hours, how did you juggle between your startup and school?
I started Hours. I started Hours in the beginning of my junior year in high school. I started at like 9 p.m. Yeah, I started it October of 2020. Yeah, October of 2020. So that was like the beginning of my junior year. Yeah.
Well, I guess that was 2 more questions. So, Cox, are you free to answer more, or do you want to just call it a day?
I could probably answer 1 more.
Well, I guess since no one's asking it, I have one for you. So, Calix, what is the greatest piece of advice that you received in your startup journey?
Okay. The greatest piece of advice. Ship. Okay, we all collectively. Okay, we all collectively agree it's ship. Just like put things out there as fast as you can. Make sure you're being intentional with where you ship it. Like, no point in shipping a productivity tool to an effective altruism community. Actually, maybe that's not true. There's no point. Okay, that's a better one. There's no point in shipping a barbecue eating startup to a veganism community. So that's an exaggerated example, but just be intentional with where you're shipping it, but just put it out there and get feedback as quick as possible. These cats.
Well, Calix, thank you for answering these questions. It was very informative for all of our participants as well. So we just all like to give you a collective thank you for I guess like being part of the same.
For sure. And thank you to my friends as well, Kevin, Nima, William.
Thank you to the Curious organization. You guys going on this call is amazing. It shows that you guys are passionate and taking the first step towards shipping. So what I want is after this call, if there's a Discord channel somewhere, you guys have to ship one thing, an idea. It can be an article, it can be anything, but you have to ship one thing at least. Because if you have taken anything from this presentation, it's that you gotta ship. But anyways, thank you for this presentation.
Okay. Yeah. So, just again, thank you to Alex and everyone who answered all the questions. But we'll just stop the recording here, and we'll just see everyone in a later workshop.
Thanks, everyone.